From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and ahead today out of Iowa State University, Lee Schulz will offer this week's remarks on the cattle market trends. Among other things, Lee will go over his new analysis of fall calf marketing decisions and the likely returns to backgrounding those calves. Also today, K-State's John Holman talks with Sarah Moyer about annual forage production options for you cattle producers, based on his extensive field research on annual forage rotations. This week's Forage segment introduces the newly appointed manager of the Forage New Youth and Adult Audiences program, Ruddy Benavides. And K-State's Charlie Lee will talk about what to realistically expect from establishing winter food plots for wildlife here in the fall. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. For this week's cattle market insight, we turn now to a livestock economist who operates out of Iowa State University, welcoming back Lee Schulz. In a moment, Lee is going to share with us the talking points from a recent analysis he put together on the options for the fall calf crop. We'll get into that. Recapping last week's trade, once again ahead of a holiday, Lee, the cash-fed cattle market really not all that well defined, but it continues to demonstrate a weaker tone.
You know, I think beyond looking at Monday, we did see a little bit of support coming off the relatively friendly cattle on feed report. We did see the market weaken throughout the week, and I think really just reflecting the situation that there is quite a few market-ready supplies. We've seen cash and futures really trade at about the same levels. Actually, last week was the first time I showed Iowa fed cattle cash price was below the futures price. Second time this year we've seen that. So I think it's really showing kind of the weakness that we're starting out in the fall. You know, feeder cattle, we did see a little bit more support this last week than compared to the fed cattle market. But I think we're going to also starting to see those weaken a bit as we get into the fall, as we see more of those calves being weaned and more of those calves coming to market.
The supplies are growing, the demand side, at least domestically, a bit sluggish as well, and no help from that side of it, is there?
I think that is really the sentiment. Export demand has been strong. That's helped prop up the market a little bit. I think we might get a little bit of a post-holiday buy-in here from the domestic side that could help the markets here in the short term. But really, we are turning the point into that fall period where we do see a little bit of demand weakness and those increase in supplies.
With that in mind, let's talk about this information that you put together in a recent newsletter article out of Iowa State on the fall backgrounding and stocker margins and the opportunities for cow-calf producers to market their calves, either retain ownership or sell them outright. One of the things that you want producers to do is to get a decent handle on 2 things, the cost of gain and the likely value of gain for those calves, correct?
That is correct, and I think it's never too early to start planning. As we've seen the last couple of years, markets can be very dynamic going into the fall. So I think having a plan in place and be able to update that plan as we place those animals, as we wean those calves, is very important. So that's why I think starting to do that analysis here in September, even though maybe weaning's a month off or so, is very important. I think it's important to look at the current price weight slide. So as we see, as weights increase, prices decrease, but you're selling at a higher weight, we really see that the added value from increasing 100 pounds in this market is much higher than the current cost of gain. And that's really true for lightweight calves as well as heavyweight calves. So right now, that is very much an incentive for backgrounding. or purchasing calves as stockers if that price-weight relationship holds. Now, we know that that doesn't hold over time, and there's changes in how that relationship does look.
So when we think about the possibility of that relationship changing, what likely could enter the picture here that might shift that outlook on retaining ownership, on backgrounding?
I think the key factors are very much the fundamentals in the market. When we look at the supply of those feeder cattle, at when do they come online, when are they marketed from cow-calf producers, how many cow-calf producers decide to wean calves, what are the stocker purchase decisions, as well as demand from feedlots, too. I think that's sometimes often not looked at as much from a backgrounding stocker situation. But if feedlots have an incentive to purchase lightweight calves, that could impact some of those value of gain margins for typical backgrounders or stockers. I think it's really important that we look at projections of what those value of gain are, and we can utilize futures markets and basis estimates to do that relatively easy. For example, I ran a recent example here using futures prices on September 1st and basis estimates that I have here in Iowa. It showed that if I'm looking at placing a weaned calf or purchasing a weaned calf, a 5-weight in October, and marketing that 5-weight at a 6-weight calf either in November, December, depending on average daily gain and number of days on feed, that value of gain right now is projected in about the mid-80s per hundredweight. That translates to the same as $1 per head, given it's 100 pounds. So looking at that value of gain, that's above current cost of gain in a feedlot, which is about $70 per hundredweight that I'm estimating right now. I would say that backgrounding cost of gain is a little bit lower than that. So that's a very good value of gain proposition using those projections. And we can go out further looking at backgrounding to 7-weight or 8-weight, and those are about the same, what the futures market is showing right now for those value of gain margins. Now, what's important is to compare that to your own cost of gain. I'm using about $70 cost of gain as my benchmark here. If you are higher in that $80 range, that's becoming closer to break even on what those current value of gain margins are. On the flip side, if you're less, well, that increases that value proposition from backgrounding calves.
So right now, again, the backgrounding option looks to be the most optimum for the cow-calf producer, the stocker operator that has potential. But you, in your article, note that you would like producers to remain quite nimble in this. In other words, don't lock down on a decision and to keep reassessing the prospect of backgrounding as they go along, correct?
Yes, that's very important, and I think that goes for feeder cattle marketing or fed cattle marketing. I think feeder cattle marketing, we have a little bit more flexibility because we can market those at different weights. But realizing that these markets, both the value end of it, looking at feeder cattle prices, but also the cost can change quite a bit. So reassessing that is very important. Also, projections, especially the projections I'm using here with basis-adjusted futures prices, it's very important that your basis projections are accurately reflecting the future. And so if basis changes relative to what I'm using as maybe a 3-year or a 5-year average, that very much changes your projections. So a way to really make sure you are up to date in those projections is continually making those to give you really a best estimate of what your value of gain is going to be.
And one quick footnote here, as noted as well in your article, considering things such as the value of preconditioning, the cost of that program, and the returns to that program, that needs to be plugged in here too, you say? Yes,
very, very much so. Recent research has shown that value of preconditioning, at least here in Iowa, I've shown it's ranged from about $2 to about $7 for steers. It's about $6 to about $11 for heifers. And so realizing that does add some value to your marketings, but there is an additional cost of doing that in any health or nutrition management. And so that all needs to come into play when you're making these value of gain calculations.
Lee, you have put together some new numbers as well on cattle feedlot returns, and it's been feared that these returns would continue to
dwindle, and in fact they are, you think, destined to head south? It looks to be August was a real turning point. My projections currently show profitable feedlot margins for August on a cash market basis and turning to red ink here in September, realizing that I am using a cash market model and an assumed cost of production. But I think when we get into the fourth quarter, it's going to show significant red ink, really in the tune of about $150 to $200 per head losses. And then I think there is some possibility as we get into 2018, as some of those deferred futures, as we're looking at right now, do show support to really turn back into maybe not as large losses or near break-even levels into 2018. So what that means is I think really looking at your risk management plans, especially as we're looking at cattle we're placing currently, for opportunities in 2018 to maybe help offset some of the losses that we're going to likely face here in the fourth quarter. So cattle feeders batten down for another rough patch ahead. And before we let you go, Lee, some buzz out there that the fed cattle market might drift below $100. Will that materialize? Any thoughts? I think, that looking at the short term, really that is going to be the resistance point. But for any means that it is just an even number and a number that we've been really staring at for some time. Futures markets right now are suggesting we're going to stay above that. I think really what's going to be a key barometer is looking at the cash trade to see really what are the buildup in market-ready supplies. If those are a little bit more spread out than maybe anticipated, I think we could stay north of that line. In the short term here, I think we could see a little bit of volatility this week coming off a 3-day weekend as investors adjust their positions, especially as we start September here. We're likely to stay a little bit north of that $1 line, but likely see some volatility here, at least in the short run. All right, we appreciate your time, Lee, and your input, and we will catch up with you again soon. Many thanks to you. Thank you. Lee Schulz with us via phone from his office in Ames, Iowa, where he is a livestock economist at Iowa State University. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Sarah Moyer, and with us, we have K-State Cropping Systems agronomist John Holman. He is out in Garden City to talk with us about forage crops and going to talk about some of the stocking rate considerations. Good to have you on, John.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to join you today, and a good timely thing to be talking about forages as we come into the fall time of the year.
As producers are making those decisions and thinking about stocking rates, of course, the weather conditions from the summer and some of those things will be playing in. So how do you think this year might just be a little different than others?
Well, great question. We've been blessed with pretty good moisture in our area, in western Kansas and really the Great Plains region. As we look outside of that area, of course, the Great Plains is home to many cattle, beef cattle, stocker, and feedlot. And so there's always a high demand for forages in across the region.
The discussion that we'd like to steer this to today is talking about forage crops. You were a speaker at a field day, a ranch management field day specifically near Spearville. What were some of the tidbits of advice that you gave to producers in attendance?
Right. We had a great field day between KLA and K-State at the Black Diamond Angus and Warner Angus Ranch north of Spearville. And one of the topics that we discussed is some of the forage research that we've been doing at K-State, really covering the past 10 years in the High Plains region, we experience drought on average 1 in every 5 years. So most recently that was real evident in 2010 through 2012. We've been about 5 years now where we've had nice moisture, been blessed with good precipitation and good forage base, but we can't get lax into thinking that's the way it always is. We need to be kind of prepared for the worst case scenario. And like I say, if you look back historically, we experience drought conditions or where we have less than 70% of annual precip about once every 5 years. And so one of the things we talked about is having a plan in place so that your forage needs are met. There's a lot of interest most recently in growing cover crops in traditional grain rotations, but then grazing those cover crops, and I think that has a good fit for both the grain producer and either a stocker or cow-calf operation, and some opportunities there to really take advantage of the extra things we can get out of the system by increasing crop intensity a little bit, taking advantage of the extra moisture that we might be able to utilize, while at the same time being conservative and not cropping too intensively in our area, because our area is always kind of prone to some drying conditions from time to time. And by being able to integrate both the cattle and the cropping sector may be one way to mitigate some of those shortages of forages in those years they occur.
And what adjustments to that base system for using forage crops have you seen producers have success with?
Yeah, good question. So we've been working with one of the studies that we've been doing for over 10 years now is growing either a cover crop or a forage crop. And so a true cover crop, we just leave that as a standing cover crop, or the forage crop, we hay that off. And now, more recently, we've also had some work where we're grazing that off. But what we have found is that in those real dry years, no matter what we do by reducing fallow, we see negative impacts on the subsequent crop. And then in favorable years, we do not see a negative impact on the subsequent crop. But when we grow a cover crop, just a true cover crop standing in the field, that has been a negative cash flow. But when we grow a forage crop, we can increase profitability by including that in the rotation. But one of the things that we've seen is the variability in precipitation in the semi-arid environment. We can expect anywhere from a twofold difference in forage yield between a dry year and a wet year. And so when a producer is looking at their system and identifies the opportunities to grow forages, and again, it's a very unique system, and that every operation is different in how they can integrate forages into their system. But we have seen a lot of opportunity here to do so and increase profit. What we have seen, though, and what we recommend is having a base plan in place where your yield may be a little more conservative. Maybe start out with an average expectation of what your long-term forage yields might be, but then have an alternative plan in place if rainfall comes and yield winds up being twice what you might expect, or it turns dry and your yields are only half of what you expected, and then you really need to have a plan of how you're going to feed those cattle. So, whether that be that you're running stockers or you're a cow-calf person, what is your alternative plan? What other forage resources do you have available? We recommend having kind of an insurance plan in place where we do experience for occasional drought, but we do have these real excellent years. And how can we bring in more cattle or take advantage of that extra crop and maybe put some of that up as baled hay or silage to carry over for the next year when it may turn dry.
And another element to trying to plan ahead a little bit with forages, and as the years fluctuate, what are some varieties or what are some types of crops that you've seen succeed, specific species or otherwise?
Well, you bring up several good points. The first being, what do you do for that insurance plan? Because in a drought year, it wasn't too long ago, we had in 2011, 2012, there was feed being hauled from North Dakota to Texas, and a lot of that feed was not very high quality feed. So if we can raise some higher quality feed here locally in the good years, and we can put that in storage, that may be the cheaper alternative in the long term. Now, you will have some forage loss of bales, so everybody knows if a bale sits there for too long, you will have some storage loss. So, I wouldn't recommend having too much in storage, but I think a little bit in storage until you can find some alternative feed sources in those dry years is a good strategy. We have looked at many different types of species of the different types of potential cover crop and forage sources. And so really the type of crop you might select depends largely on the time of the year that you would be planting. So let's just look at this fall, going into this fall window, maybe what growers might consider this planting this time of the year. So we're past the prime growing season, going into the cooler time of the year, so we need to be looking at some cool season species, which might include winter wheat, possibly as a dual purpose use, where we might get some grazing on that this fall, early spring, and then take it to a grain crop. Other alternatives would be winter triticale or winter rye for sure. We can plant a spring species, say spring triticale or spring oat, either by itself or in combination with a winter cool season forage crop, and that spring crop will have more biomass production in the fall, so that's a way to increase forage yield in the fall. And most of the time that spring crop will then winter kill, and if it's in a mixture with a winter type, like say winter triticale, then it'll resume growth in the spring. And so by combining the two species, spring with a winter, we can get a bump in the fall production and then have good spring growth. We might consider putting in that mixture, say some radish or turnip with the crop at the same time. The radish or turnip produces a large taproot, which may help with increasing water infiltration. It also provides another forage resource, so there are some mixes of that type that could be beneficial for growers.
Well, hopefully some of those considerations have producers thinking about this fall and what they plan to do for forage.
I might add
Sure.
Another very valuable resource that growers might consider looking at is we do have a statewide forage testing program for summer forages of the different types of sorghum, hay, and silage, and that information is available through their county agents and also through the K-State agronomy website. So that's a very valuable resource where we provide yield and quality data, because a lot of growers will be feeding the summer hay types this winter, the forage sorghum type hays.
So do check out some of those resources online. Again, the agronomy website, or of course you can always contact your local extension office to inquire about these resources. John, thank you again.
Thank you, Sarah. Have a great day.
K-State Cropping Systems agronomist John Holman. He is in the Southwest Research and Extension Office. I'm Sarah Moyer, and this is Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Well, because we were away yesterday for the Labor Day break, we've some catching up to do today, including the weekly 4-H segment. And briefly here, we'd like to introduce the just appointed new Youth and Adult Audiences Program Manager for 4-H in Kansas, Ruddy Benavides. She's a native of western Kansas and has been involved in 4-H outreach to new youth groups in Garden City prior to taking on this new assignment.
I am actually, I was born and raised in Greeley County in western Kansas, and even though it was a really rural county, rural town, I was not really exposed to 4-H or what Extension did, and my misconception of 4-H was that I had to have livestock or, my dad was a feedlot truck driver, but we didn't necessarily interact with the animals, so I thought I could never be in 4-H. Fast forward to high school, I actually entered some photographs into the open class county fair, and that kind of sparked my interest in what does this program actually do. And thankfully at K-State, I got this internship to do a pilot program out in southwest Kansas in Garden City, and I was an intern there, and I really got thrown into this wonderful program of the realm of 4-H youth development. And I said, I want to build a career out of this. This was amazing. And not only coming from a new youth perspective as well, I don't come from a family of a 4-H legacy. I was the first one in my family to really get involved with 4-H. So that internship really opened a whole new world of this, youth development and what it is, especially being from a rural community. I was very proud of that, and I wanted to give back. And I said giving back to, kids who were like me, whose parents may not have known what 4-H was or was not accessible. And I said, I want to make this a career. And so after that internship was a little taste, and I wanted more. So I came back on board at the state office here, and in 2015, and I was here for a summer, and I got involved with culturally responsive programming and got more involved into how that plays a part into 4-H youth development and how do we reach underrepresented kids in the state of Kansas. And I went to University of Nebraska-Lincoln to complete my master's. I just finished this August, and I couldn't stay away. I came back here, and now I'm back in Kansas, and very thankful for this opportunity with Kansas 4-H. I love being back in my home state, and I want more than give back to my state, and coming from this different perspective of maybe a non-legacy 4-H member and coming with a different lens. My primary experience was with the Latino community, and I'm excited to work with the many other underrepresented populations in the state of Kansas. And I have high aspirations to reach out to them and hopefully have some more amazing programming coming in the next few months. Look forward to working with the staff across the state.
Ruddy Benavides, K-State Research and Extension, the new Youth and Adult Audience Program Manager for 4-H in Kansas. You can learn more about that initiative, by the way, at kansas4h.org. Now, this week's edition of Tree Tales. Here's K-State forester Charlie Barden. Charlie?
Did you know that trees played an important part in Kansas history? In today's column, I will discuss several ways trees helped shape Kansas. The first American explorers labeled the Great Plains area the Great American Desert. They were coming from the eastern states, and they thought that if this land could not support dense, tall forests, then it must be too infertile or too dry to grow crops. Of course, now this region is the world's breadbasket due to our productive croplands. As early settlers crossed the Kansas prairie, they usually headed for cottonwood trees to make camp. The tall trees were important landmarks which could be seen for miles over the grassy landscape. They knew that a grove of cottonwoods usually indicated that water was present too. The shade was welcome shelter from the hot prairie sun, while the fallen limbs were used for firewood. I'm sure the pioneers' meals tasted better cooked over a wood fire than over dried buffalo chips. The cottonwood is also the official Kansas state tree. In Lynn and Bourbon counties in eastern Kansas flows Sugar Creek and the town of Mapleton, both named for the sugar maples that can still be found growing in these valleys and north-facing slopes of the area. In the mid-1800s, there was an active maple sugaring operation there, like we see today in Michigan and Vermont. Many of the larger rivers in Kansas, like the Delaware, Kansas, Smoky Hill, Republican, and Saline rivers, had extensive groves of timber growing on their banks, but much of these bottomland forests were cut for timber or cleared for agricultural crops. This has led to unstable stream banks in many areas and resulted in muddy water and increased siltation in our reservoirs. Replacing the streamside trees now, called riparian buffers, is an important conservation practice promoted by state agencies and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. You've been listening to Tree Tales. I'm Charles Barden, Forest with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Charlie. And for this week's edition of Milk Lines, here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I want to talk with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the anionic balance of their animals just prior to parturition or calving. You know, over the last several years, we've done a lot of work with farms to try to get them to pay attention to how they're balancing diets just prior to freshening of their animals. And we've learned a lot from that. There's some new data, though, that comes from the University of Florida that might be important as you consider this question on your farm. Again, fall is a really good time to really reevaluate this. Likely you've gotten some new forages in on the farm that you'll be feeding to these animals 3 weeks prior to calving. So, good time to maybe take a look at the overall picture. Some of the new data out of the University of Florida indicates that maybe we don't have to go quite as negative with those diets as we have in the past. And when I mean negative, in other words, in DCAD balance, or mega equivalents per 100 grams. Normally, we've run maybe negative 15 to negative 20 in those diets as we evaluate the DCAD equation. However, some recent data from the University of Florida indicates that maybe we need to only go to negative 7. And some other interesting things about the particular study that I'm talking about is they actually looked at feeding diets for 21 days and also 42 days prior to calving. Now, normally we've always suggested that only the last 3 weeks prior to calving should you feed DCAD diets, and you shouldn't go longer than that. However, this new study indicates that it might be possible to go as long as 42 days without detrimental effects. So why do we do this to our animals? Well, we're trying to decrease the anionic balance in the animals themselves. In other words, put them in a negative state so that they will pull more calcium from their body. Why do we do this? Well, if we can do this, they're better able to meet the calcium needs that they will experience once they calve and start producing milk. So, it's a really important concept, and if we can make this work, we actually will increase the productivity of the animals, but more importantly, we will decrease the issues that they might have with various metabolic health issues as they calve in and start lactation. One critical thing that still rises to the top and really trumps all the ration balancing that we do is actually going out and taking some urine samples and determining the pH. Again, for Holstein animals in this pre-fresh period that have been on an anionic salt diet for at least 7 days, the urine pH should be about 5.8 to 6.5. And for Jersey animals, just slightly lower, 5.6 to 6.2. So, rumen pH still trumps what we do with the balancing of the diet. So if you're not doing that on your farm, you should consider starting. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
We'll be back with more, including our weekly visit with K-State's Charlie Lee. After this is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This Agriculture Today concludes with our weekly stint on wildlife management. Across the way now, Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, you suggest this week there may still be time for those interested in attracting deer to their premises to establish a fall food plot, a crop of some type, although that window is closing rapidly, you say.
Yes, if you're going to establish a deer or other wildlife food plot for this fall, you need to be getting started almost immediately. Unfortunately, that means you're not going to be able to do a real good job of planning. Perhaps maybe this would have been better if we talked about establishing spring food plots. But one of the questions that I get asked is, what is the best food plot out there? What should I plant?
No magic answer there?
There's no magic answer. There's no one best food plot, either the mix, the size, or the location. I really need to ask the producer a couple of questions first, and the main one is, what do they want to accomplish with this food plot? Do they want to try to attract more deer? Are they interested in attracting all species of wildlife? If they want more deer, do they want bigger deer, bigger antlers? What do they really expect? Are they expecting healthier fawns, more fawns in the spring, a faster fawn growth? Or are they simply wanting the deer to come into a location where they're easier to see, to hunt, to either take or just observe? When we get answers to those questions, then we can start coming up with ideas on the proper mixture for that deer food plot. Then we need to ask the second most important question, and that's, what do they have now? Mm-hmm. Have they done some sort of an evaluation of habitat on site? As we've talked many times in the past, deer diet is pretty consistent across the U.S. A summary of over 70 research reports in the U.S. from north to the south part of the U.S. on white-tailed deer showed 46% of deer are feeding on browse, 24% are feeding on forbs, 11% on mass or nuts, if you will, from trees, and 8% of that diet is grass. So those would be the top 4 species, and you notice crops wasn't in there. That comes in as number 5. So once we have that evaluation of what's out there existing, can we manage the existing habitat? Sometimes it may be easier just to simply do a fall fertilization program on native areas that either they're woodlands or odd areas to try to improve the palatability and quality of some of the existing vegetation that's growing naturally.
But it's pretty clear that deer require a diversity of plant resources here, planted crop plots and otherwise?
Well, deer certainly will select based on their nutritive need first, and then palatability is kind of one of the things kind of far down on the list. Young deer do not learn what to eat by observing older deer in the group, but they simply seem to find the innate behavior and select those plant species that their body needs at that particular time. So when we sort through all of that, still we get down to, I want to get something in the ground. I need some sort of a planted material there that I can drive by, and deer are going to find it attractive.
All right. If a landowner is at that point, then what would be the best crop options, or at least the selections that are available that they might consider?
Well, some of the better fall food plot species would be the brassicas. There'd be turnips, rapeseeds, radishes. Those species producing leafy green tops. They got a lot of protein. They're highly palatable to deer, especially when it's after a hard frost, when those starches in those start to turn into sugars. Those large leaves seem to do a pretty good job of shading out competition from weeds or forbs. You may see trying to overtake your planting, but keep in mind when those weeds are in your planting, doesn't mean that that's something that deer find unpalatable. Many of the common weeds are highly palatable and selected by deer, such as ragweeds. Giant ragweed is a species that deer relish. It's a plant that is high in nutritive value.
A lot of folks think that legume crops are a rich nutritive resource for deer. Would they be among some of the other considerations?
Yes, certainly are a very good food plot in some situations. We've got lots of clovers, whether perennials or annual clovers. We also have some cereal grains that do well, wheat, oats. Some of them tend to freeze down, turn brown, then they're probably not relished as much. But there's certainly lots of different options for fall food plots for deer.
The common denominator there, something that will stay green and attractive to deer for the bulk of the winter, you say?
Well, I like plants that produce some tonnage and then that stay green throughout the growing season, and many of them do just that. We get real severe weather, even things like wheat's going to brown off. You'll often find some of those even when they're covered with snow, that deer will paw through that snow to find that green material underneath. It doesn't have to be an exotic species that you saw advertised on somewhere in the back of a hunting magazine of some new exotic crop that's going to attract deer. What you want to plant is something that's not readily available in the neighborhood. If you're surrounded by wheat fields, probably that's not going to be the best choice. And then you might want to think about one of the legumes. If you don't have cereal grains in an area, say you're primarily rangeland, then there's lots of other options that will work for these food plots in the fall.
Lastly, before one does anything, they need to assess the situation, the location, the available cover nearby, a lot of ingredients here.
A lot of those are considerations when you try to determine exactly where to put the food plot. Remembering the type of food plot is just one of the things to consider. You also have to think about that particular location. I like to encourage people to put them into old crop fields so that we're not breaking out native vegetation. And there seems to be plenty of those little odd-shaped areas around that are in the 2 to 3 acre size that just work great for fall food plots.
Well, landowners, if this is your intent, you need to get after this project right away. That is, if you have designs on establishing a food plot for deer here in the fall. Charlie, thanks for the overview of accomplishing this today. He's a wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. That's our time for today. Thanks to you for listening in, and we'll be back again tomorrow this same time. Until then, and for Sarah Moyer, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.